In this, our fourth lecture, we continue our exploration of life lessons that we can draw from the great books, and our focus in this section on the theme of the unconquerable human spirit, of how the great books teach us as individuals to understand bad things that may happen to us, why bad things seem to happen to good people, how to bear up in the adversity that life brings to each and every one of us. We have focused upon the idea that each of these great books partakes of and builds upon a tradition. That Seneca, the first work that we studied, drew upon the lessons of Socrates, that the very Gospel of John draws upon the philosophical wisdom of Greece as well as the traditions of Judaism, and that Boethius, in his Consolation of Philosophy, brings together Christianity and the wisdom of the Greeks and Romans to understand the question of, if God is good, why does evil exist? And this same theme is explored in one of the most powerful novels ever written, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It is a work that has been called by no other than Sigmund Freud the greatest novel ever written. It is a story that begins as its quotation with a sentence from the Gospel of John, that if a grain of wheat falls upon the ground and dies, it abideth forever and brings forth much fruit. In other words, the death, and out of death comes life. The same way that Seneca affirmed that his life would go on, his soul was unconquered, even if his body died. The message of Socrates, that the soul is immortal. And the lesson, the fundamental mystery of Christianity, that out of death comes life. And this gripped the mind of Fyodor Dostoevsky as he explored his own life, the sufferings that he underwent, and at the same time, as a true Russian patriot, sought to understand the unique tradition of Mother Russia. We believe that a great book can certainly make you better as an individual, give you the wisdom to live your life. But a great book can often help you reflect upon the fundamental issues that all of us face as citizens of a free country. And Russia is one of those issues. Our involvement in the Middle East has led us to disregard, I think in a dangerous way, the importance of Russia and the role that Russia has played all through history. And we have also ignored the lesson taught to us by one of the most moving and thoughtful of all Russian writers, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He had been exiled from the Soviet Union and he came to this country, and it was all expected that he would receive many awards, which he did do, and praise our system, our democracy, our capitalism. Instead, at Harvard University, he said, "You completely fail to understand that Russia is a distinct culture, as distinct from you as China and just as noble." Russia. The Brothers Karamazov is one of the enduring monuments of creativity under the despotism of the 19th century czars, and of the creative movement that would unleash powerful forces, both social, economic, political, as well as intellectual. Russia. The czars of the 19th century took it as the slogan of their rule that Russia needed autocracy and orthodoxy. In other words, an exact contrast to our country and to the tradition of Western Europe, that we believe in democracy, not autocracy. We believe in freedom of a conscience as opposed to absolute enforced orthodoxy, that everybody will believe the same way. But in fact, autocracy and orthodoxy are the very foundation of Russian history. We saw in our last lecture that in 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and moved the capital to Constantinople. And the Christian empire centered both in Constantinople and in Rome. But in the course of the 4th, and more importantly in the 5th century, Roman power in the West came to an end. And in the West, the position of the emperor was in many ways taken by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And it was the Pope of Rome, for example, that when Attila the Hun came down and threatened to destroy the city, went out and reasoned with the great savage chieftain and had him march away. And in the course of the 5th century in Rome, the popes developed a theory that became fundamental for political thought in Western Europe. And that is, there are two powers, two swords they are called, the power of this earth and the power of God, the temporal power, the sacred power. And the emperor, the king, is the embodiment of that temporal power. And the pope is the embodiment, as the vicegerent of God, of that sacred power. But the soul is superior to the body, and therefore ultimately the pope is the supreme ruler. And time again in the Middle Ages, the most powerful of emperors, the most powerful of kings, were forced to kneel in homage to the Pope in terror of the excommunication and their loss of their immortal souls and damnation. This never developed in Russia. Russia began in the midst of time as a Viking nation. The Russians believed that in the 9th century, Viking war chiefs sailed down the rivers of Russia, invited in by the Slavic tribes, and the first of these great war chiefs, Rurik, established the beginning of the Russian state that would flourish in Kiev. And Russia adopted its Christianity, not from Rome, but from Constantinople. The Orthodox Church in Constantinople, and Orthodox just means thinking the right way, had never admitted to the power of the Pope. Constantine had viewed himself as both bishop and king. And one of his first actions after he had come to power in 312 was to convene conferences of bishops in order to enforce orthodoxy, to put an end to doctrinal disputes, and to establish one true belief in Christianity, one true conception of God the Father, one true conception of the relationship between the divine and the human in Christ, and to enforce this by the power of the sword. So the emperor as bishop and head of the church. And when in the 10th century Russia began to think about adopting Christianity, the Russian ruler considered a number of different faiths. In fact, he invited Muslims to come and explain why they should convert to the Muslim faith. And it sounded very, very good. One God, and the Quran was very impressive. But then it was explained to him that the Muslim religion did not permit alcohol. And he said, but drink is the joy of the Rus, so that would not work. But he was deeply impressed with the splendor of the Orthodox ceremonies. And Russia took its Christianity from Constantinople. And with it, this idea that the ruler himself is the absolute voice of God on earth. And with it, the idea that God has ruled that there will be only one power, not democracy, but the absolute rule of a monarch. And so it passed on down through the centuries. The orthodoxy of the church allied with the power of the Tsar. And time again, Russia failed to take the path that was taken in Western Europe. While England was developing instruments of parliamentary government, Russia stayed rooted in autocracy. Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, despotic forces that would shape Russian history, but continue the great line of autocracy. We should not be surprised that when communism collapsed in the old Soviet Union, that democracy would not rise up in its place, but that Russia again would see a vigorous dictator, Vladimir Putin, establishing again this autocracy. And in the 19th century, autocracy and orthodoxy ruled Russia. Russia had serfs who in terms of their legal status may have differed somewhat from slaves, but essentially they were slaves tied to the land. Families could be broken apart. And into this world of the absolute rule of the Tsar, serfdom, was born Fyodor Dostoevsky in 1821. His father was fairly well off, owned a number of serfs, and was actually a rather brutal man. And finally seems to have been murdered by his own serfs. Fyodor was educated at a military school. He didn't have much liking for the military life, but he served briefly. But he was unsuited to it because he was an epileptic. And probably at the age of 9, he suffered his first attack of epilepsy. This disease that goes all the way back to the days of ancient Egypt, that we've known for 5,000 years, that's described by Hippocrates, that the Greeks and Romans called the sacred disease. And to Dostoevsky, his epilepsy itself was a mystery. Doctors couldn't explain it then. They still have trouble explaining it now. Why did it come, and why was he chosen to have it? Why? Why it had been passed on to him. But he graduated from the military school, served briefly, then resigned his commission and began to write. That was his true calling, to write. But this was an age in which conspiracies against the Tsar arose, and Western ideas, European ideas, had percolated into Russia, and many sought to raise up a revolution against the Tsar and establish a liberal democracy, at least get a constitution as a start. And Dostoevsky was drawn into these revolutionary circles, arrested for disseminating propaganda and treason, and was in front of a firing squad when at the last moment his sentence was commuted. And he spent 5 years out in Siberia from 1849 until 1854 in prison. When he was released, he was forced to serve 5 more years in a penal battalion, a disciplinary battalion. So almost 10 years of his life taken away. Epilepsy, 10 years of his life taken away. That would have crushed most people. But he turned his energy into creativity and continued to write. There was a deeply sensual side to Dostoevsky. He gambled, he drank. Time and time again, he had to finish a book contract just to pay off his debts. At one point, he had to flee to Europe to escape his creditors. And there in Europe, he continued to gamble at the casinos, squandering whatever money he had, neglecting his family. But there was also a deeply spiritual side. And more he became convinced that in the mystery of the Russian Orthodox Church, in the power of the icon with its golden background, in the deep eyes of the saints and Madonnas and the Christ, the suffering Christ, or the Christ who is the judge of the world, you rose up into a mystical union of love with God. And that love with God, that mystical union with God, that was the very essence of Christianity. And the love that God would send His own Son into the world, and the mystery that He would make that Son die for salvation, was like the mystery of the grain of corn, of wheat that falls to the ground and must die in order to produce life. His great Crime and Punishment was written in this period of creativity. And he married again and had a son that was the absolute light of his life and gave him the joy he had never had before. But he had also passed on to the child his epilepsy. And that again was a question, why? Why had that little child been caused to suffer these terrible seizures? And he began to plan a great book. And he sketched it out to his friends that would become the brothers Karamazov. The question of evil and good that is in every human being. And as he was in the midst of writing it, his little boy, only 3 years of age, died of an epileptic seizure. So more pain and more questioning of why. And all this questioning of Russia's place in the world, the meaning of God, all came forth in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. It is a story of a family, what we would call a dysfunctional family. The father is Theodore, just like Fyodor Dostoevsky. He is a cruel and sensuous man, given to drunken excesses, has many mistresses. From 2 wives, he has 3 sons, the heroes of the novel. His oldest son, Dmitri, is much like the father. squanders vast amounts of money, drinks uncontrollably, and even competes with his father for the love of the same mistress. There is Ivan, who is the Russian rationalist. He's deeply imbued with the ideas of the West and of reason and democracy. And there is the youngest son, Alexei, who bears the same name as Dostoevsky's son, Alexei. And he is the spiritual one, the one who believes he has been called into the church and is taking his orders as a monk. And then there's Smerdyakov, the child of vileness, the product of an illicit relationship between the father and a woman of dubious reputation. And he has been sent by his father to learn to be a cook, has come back and is treated by his father like a servant. Now, each of these four sons represents one part in Dostoevsky's mind of the Russian soul. And in his magnificent book, The Idiot, the story of a truly pure soul and how he is destroyed by the world, Dostoevsky writes, the Russian soul is a dark place. And so in the Russian soul there is, as in the father and in Dmitri, a violent, sensuous character. The huge, drunken orgies of a Stalin, the vast quantities of food and alcohol consumed, the sheer violence and cruelty that time and time again has marked Russia's history. And then there are those who try to import Western ideas. And for Dostoevsky, these are always misguided individuals. They're the ones in his novel who come back into Russia from studying abroad, wearing, instead of great felt boots, little spats. Instead of a heavy overcoat, they wear the little overcoats they have worn in Switzerland, not realizing that the climate of Russia, like the mind of Russia, is totally different than that of Europe. And that is Ivan with his ideas of democracy and freedom and rationalism instead of religion. And there's Alexei. He represents the true spirit of Russia, its deep faith, its conviction that out of suffering will come good. And then there's Smerdyakov, the child of vileness. He's a mystery. The father doesn't understand him. He is an epileptic. He seems at first rather mentally limited, but he's cunning and deep. He's like the Russia that Winston Churchill described as a riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma that no one can really understand, and that there is a very deep and even evil side to him. And the action is motivated by a quarrel between Dmitri and his father over money that has its real roots in their competition for the same woman. And Dmitri is demanding the money that has been left to him by his mother, the first wife of the father. And the quarrel gets very legalistic, and finally Alexei offers to intervene and to bring the whole family together for discussion, and chooses where he lives as a monk, the monastery there. And they all come together to debate this question of the inheritance, with all the violence that money can arouse in a family. And Alexei is the student of the monk Father Zosima. And Father Zosima has become a local hero. He is even credited with works of miracles. And he teaches simply pure love, that there is no other creed except love. And Christ is love and light, and that the whole of the world is to be joined together in universal love. That is all Christ ever preached, was love one another, be like little children. And of course, for teaching the truth, he is hated by his fellow monks, and they despise him, and constantly of keeping a dossier on him the same way that the Pharisees kept a dossier on Jesus, trying to undermine his credibility. And the debate goes on in the family, and ultimately that loses its significance compared to the murder that occurs. Because in the midst of this struggle over the inheritance, the father is found dead. The son Dmitri is splattered with blood and has a cane in his hand, and he is brought up on trial. In the course of all of this, Ivan and his brother Alexei get to know each other, sons of a different mother. And Ivan, again and again, simply makes fun of his brother who has become a monk. How can you believe in the 19th century, all that stuff? The resurrection, do you really believe that happened? Do you think somebody can come back from the dead? Show me somebody. In fact, in the course of the story, Father Zosima dies, and immediately his body begins to rot. You see, even your beloved Father Zosima, he will corrupt. There is no such thing as a resurrection, and all religion is just an opium set in place to keep ordinary people quiet. And Alexei again and again comes back to, what about love? Love has no role in the world. It is a pure emotion, and man is all about reason, and Christianity is opposed to reason. One day, as they're discussing, Ivan says, I would like to show you a poem I have been writing. Poem, maybe it's just a work of prose, but I want you to see it. And this, the story of Ivan that he reads to his brother, becomes the very centerpiece of the novel. It is the story of the Grand Inquisitor. And the brother begins to read it to Alexei the monk. He says, here, I want you to understand what Christ really meant. My book, he says, my poem, my religious poem, that's what you can call it, a religious poem, is set in Seville, in Spain, in the middle of the 16th century, the age of the Inquisition. That great statement of Christianity in which people were burned to the death, burned at the stake for not believing exactly what the church told them, where anonymous accusations were used and torture was used, and where even if you confessed, once you'd been accused, you were burned alive so that your soul might be saved even if your body perished. That was Christian love. And on this day in Seville, we were in the great marketplace of the town. And the day before, there had been an auto da fe, that's what they were called, an act of faith. And the Grand Inquisitor, the Cardinal, before the king and other aristocratic personages, had seen to the burning alive of 100 people. And the next day, pleased with his work that he had done for the Lord, saving so many other souls who might have been led astray by these heretics, he walked the marketplace. Tall and spare, a man of 90 years of age. The day before, he had worn his magnificent cardinal outfit, but now he was dressed in the black robes of a monk, the Jesuit that he was. And into the marketplace there appeared Jesus. And everybody, the whole crowd knew it was Jesus. And he worked miracles. He raised a little child from the dead. And the whole crowd fell down on their knees and prayed for his blessing. And watching all of this, the Grand Inquisitor was not pleased. And at the snap of his finger, the soldiers who had been kneeling to Jesus rose up and arrested Jesus and took him before the Grand Inquisitor. And there, like so many victims of the Inquisition, he was questioned all alone. And the Inquisitor asked him, I know that you are Jesus, the Christ. I know that you are he. And let me tell you this, I will have you burned alive tomorrow. The crowd will know you are Jesus, and they will burn you alive. Because you see, you have failed. The whole of your faith was a failure. You thought men wanted freedom. They want absolute rule. You think they want love. They want hate. You had your chance. Do you remember? You came out of the wilderness and the devil tempted you. The devil, that is who we serve, for he has the real understanding of power and what men and women want. And the devil took you up on a high place. You were hungry. You hadn't eaten for 40 days. And he said, turn these stones into bread. And you said, man does not live by bread alone. Well, you were wrong. He does. That's all he wants, is a full stomach. Give the people bread. and they will do anything you tell them. And time again, men and women have turned away from freedom in order to be fed. And then the devil said, cast yourself down and let the angels of God catch you. And you, Jesus said, no, it is written, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. But that would have been a miracle, and everyone would have accepted your message. For man, along with bread, wants miracles. He doesn't want knowledge, he wants simply an absolute belief. And the greater the miracle, the more he will believe. The more unreasonable it is, the more he will believe. And finally, the devil said, look out over the whole world, and I will make all of these your kingdoms. And you said, no, my kingdom is not of this world. Well, again, you were wrong. All through history, men and women have wanted bread, they have wanted miracle, and they have wanted a universal world government, which would take away from them any responsibilities, any freedom. And that is what we have been working towards. And that is what we will one day achieve. And now, I will have you burned alive. That will be the ultimate miracle. Jesus looks at him with this look of infinite tenderness and love, returning love for hate and good for evil. And the Grand Inquisitor says, here. And he opens a door that leads out into an alley and tells Jesus, just go away. You're not even worth it. And Jesus goes away. There, Ivan said, what do you think of my religious poem? You see what men are really like? You see how the whole idea of freedom and love of God has no meaning whatsoever? That is why history, all through history, man has done evil deeds. War is a constant in history, not love. Slavery is a constant in history, not love. All your love will mean nothing. That is the central mystery. Why has man and woman, again and again, turned to hate when they could have love? Chosen despotism over freedom. That was a mystery for Dostoevsky as well. The story has what some call a subplot, but is quite basic to it. And that is the love that Alexei the monk feels for this little group of children. And he finds them tormenting a child who is different from them. Even as any group will torment the outsider. Even as that crowd would have burned Jesus. And they're tormenting them, tormenting this little boy. And Alexei devotes himself to teaching them his doctrine of love. He takes it as a special sign that when Father Zosima has died and they are reading the Mass over him, they choose the story of Cana and the miracle at Cana, the turning of water into wine. The sign that God wants gladness, God wants ordinary people and their love. And as Jesus said, suffer the little children to come unto me. And there, Dostoevsky, who has just lost his little son to epilepsy, concludes his story with the death of one of these little children, and yet the graveside service, in which all the little ones who used to torment him now stand around and pray for him in true love and forgiveness. And one of them asks, Alexei, is it really true that he will rise again? And Alexei says, that is the very essence of Easter. That is why it is so important. That God has destroyed death. That is why we greet each other on Easter by saying, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Yes, he will rise up. We will all rise up. And out of death will come life. And we will walk hand in hand. Now let us walk hand in hand. Walk away from the grave and into life. And so it was that Dostoevsky refused to allow his soul to be destroyed by what many would view as the random chances of life and the misery of death, and creatively wrote this profound statement of the unconquerable human spirit.